Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. It's never been a better time to be alive, but we have to remember technology doesn't replace humanity. It expands what's possible when we use it to reduce suffering and make sure that no one is left behind. That's a quote from Dr. Isaac Balbin, my guest on this episode of The Wisdom of. And so Dr. Isaac is a technologist, entrepreneur, and visionary who sees possibility where many see complexity. He holds a PhD in electrical engineering and has published patents and built companies that bridge science, technology, and human well-being, and has an expertise across 15 different areas of technology and science and systems. He's the founder of Glide, a revolutionary education model that invites students to learn while moving, combining physical movement, curiosity, and historical context to create what he calls citizens of the future with fulfilled potential. He's also the executive director of Green Gold Trading, applying science and technology to advance evidence-based healthcare. And in our conversation, we explored what happens when technology and humanity stop competing and start collaborating. We unpack how education, AI, and healthcare could all be redesigned, not by adding more control, but by decentralising trust, inviting curiosity, and putting people back at the centre of the system. Isaac is one of those rare thinkers who can explain quantum theory and blockchain one moment and speak with deep compassion about human suffering the next. And he reminds us that technology becomes wisdom only when it serves people. And so settle in. This is the wisdom of Dr. Isaac Balbin. Well, Isaac, welcome, and thank you for joining us to record this episode.
Absolute pleasure to be here, Simon.
You cover a lot of territory in terms of the things you're interested in, the knowledge you've acquired. Let's go straight to education. It's easy to throw a lot of rocks at education. I know you have a much broader view. What's one of the biggest issues in education from your perspective?
I think one of the biggest issues is how restrictive the system is and how much of a disincentive there is for those inside the education system to be able to innovate and push the boundaries and actually get things towards where we want them to go to. It's something where in education for so long, look, I can tell you as a parent, I got really frustrated and I expressed that to the teachers and the administrators, and I thought it was because of them, and I thought they had an issue in the way they were doing things. But once I started getting in to look at it from a business perspective, to really understand, well, how does this whole system work when you want to make a change, when you've got to try to learn something different, implement a new technology. It's so hard, and the positive payoffs are so few and far between that it's just not worth it for teachers and administrators to really try to innovate too hard, because if they get it wrong, there can be very heavy consequences for that.
Yeah, it is. I have, in disclosure, I have a background in education and I've worked inside the education system, and that just rings so true. I think a lot of people work inside systems and they're fundamentally good people, but the environment always wins, right? And so I think a lot of people went into teaching with that Robin Williams Dead Poet Society, carpe diem, and standing on the desk and inspiring young minds and everything else, and realizing that, and this might lean into some of your kind of working in technology and crypto and other spaces, but systems generally don't like innovation because it upsets the system, right? And yet the system is the environment, and the environment invariably wins.
Well, that's the thing. We've come to an interesting point where we can reimagine how systems actually operate. And look, you mentioned crypto. One of the things with blockchain, the true innovation of it, people think of it so much as just, a new way of dealing with currency, but it's not. It's a new way of organizing a network without requiring someone to be in the middle and in charge of how the whole thing works. It's actually, that's the remarkable nature of what it's able to do. And similarly in education, a lot of people don't know why schools are structured the way they are, why we've got, lessons of a certain length, why we use bells to
Mm,
shift from one thing to another. And um, ironically, that lack of education about how our system was created is what allows things to really, go down a path that it shouldn't really go down. You can couple that together with the fact that schools really used to just be about that pure education side of things, where
yes.
they've almost become factories of social engineering in these days. And I think that that's something that society's still adjusting on how it actually wants to do that. With these beautiful multicultural societies that we have today, um, we have some brilliant aspects of it, but the negative aspects of it are certain people want to learn certain things, certain people may not agree with certain other things, and so we just need to work a little bit harder to come up with a common framework that can be delivered to people, regardless of who they are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have a Bachelor of Education. I studied education as a formal tertiary program. I lectured in a faculty of education at university. I principally taught in the post-secondary system. So in Australia, TAFE, and lectured at university when I realised that teenagers, I didn't have the vocational fortitude to work with teenagers the rest of my working life. But it just struck me as you were talking, when you're an undergrad studying, say, a Bachelor of Education, you study classroom behaviour management, you study the curriculum subjects you're going to teach, you study, developmental psychology, et cetera, et cetera. You study curriculum and lesson planning, but you never study the system of education. You might do one unit where you might study some alternate systems of education, like Montessori or something like that. But it's almost a throwaway unit, and so this is an interesting dynamic. That it seems like a lot of systems have this central sort of control, and then everything is out of that, and the system is running and we're not aware of the system and how we innovation, I guess, has to happen at system level across all of the disciplines. Is that a pattern you've seen?
Well, look, centralization actually is a good thing. And we were able to derive a lot of fantastic benefits like standardization and things of that nature out of it. But it's not the end of the story. And that's where I think it actually went wrong in the education system. When you look at network theory, we know that a centralized system is just a special case of a decentralized system. And those decentralized systems and networks where every single node in the network can both, be an authority or receive an authority. It's
Hmm.
just a more holistic way of looking at the possibilities in there. And so I think, in the education system, we've had a lot of those same things happen. We need to try and allow and, give teachers an opportunity to innovate and do, it's like you started off talking about people jumping on tables and teaching. And in
Yeah,
fact, I actually think that's what we need to have more of because look, ultimately, we spoke about AI, some of the AI self-taught systems out there are remarkable. I was using one of them with one of my younger kids, and it was able to really engage him and drive him to teach him some of that content. But I'll relate to you a story that I heard from Gary Kasparov, who was
hmm.
the eight-time chess international grand champion. And if you recall, IBM built a computer called Deep Blue specifically to play chess against Gary Kasparov. And the first time they played against each other, Gary won every single game. So the IBM engineers went back, put in some upgrades. They came back the second time, and the second time it was about, even Steven. IBM engineers went back, added in additional upgrades, and the third time, Deep Blue won every single game. And Gary Kasparov is telling this story, and then he says, "But what did you think I was going to do? Stop playing chess?" No, he started playing chess with an AI or with a computer assistant against other grandmasters who had their computer assistants. And then there was a tournament where anyone was allowed to enter with any computer assistant. And who won? It wasn't a grandmaster, it wasn't someone with a supercomputer. It was a 25-year-old guy with 5 Pentiums out in the middle of Alabama. And why did he win? It wasn't because he had the best chess training, and it wasn't because he had the most powerful machine. It's because what he was the best at was at using the technology to improve his game. And
Mm.
that's where I think we need to start teaching people. Don't be afraid of these innovations. Learn how to embrace and play with it to try and improve the outcomes that you're achieving without them.
So let's go to the existential question first, and then we'll come back and talk about education, glide, healthcare, and a bunch of other things that you have have real interest in and expertise. You know, you've said that this is the greatest time to be alive because of some of the things that are happening, some of the technology available to us, and at the same time, a lot of people are concerned that we have this other species on the planet called AI that could be the beginning of the end. 25% of young Australians in recent interviews were saying they think we are actually starting our spiral down to the extinction of the human race. People are worried about geopolitical issues and all sorts of things. So at the same time, and I love technology, so I'm a bit like you. I love what technology is able to do and help us with. It is certainly an alive time to be alive. Just unpack that for us, for those people that feel like I'm having an existential crisis here, versus those that are right on the front edge going, this is amazing. And then the big bell curve in the middle. Just unpack that greatest time to be alive perspective.
Yeah, so look, I think the way that I look at it is people today are missing purpose and they're missing a human connection. And, that leads them to depths of despair that they otherwise wouldn't be going down. I look at it in that same way. I'm not sure if you can relate this to maybe in your own personal life, that when you've had friends of wealthy people,
Mm.
so often that it's the wealthiest families that have the unhappiest children. Why is that? Right? Because when everything's given to you, when you don't see any value in your own work being able to produce a positive, productive outcome, then no wonder you're going to feel sad and depressed and all of these other things out there. And above and beyond that, I think what a lot of people today are struggling with is the fact that we live in what you'd call the post-truth world. And when nothing is true, then everything is true. It becomes a really challenging uh, existence for young
Yes.
people to be able to determine, how to understand, where they should go and how they should behave and how they should think of themselves. And unfortunately, it tends to lead to people being rather extreme in whatever they tend to go out there with. And when people are so extreme, again, now you're just compounding the problem because we're talking past each other rather than to each other. So I think that incredible gift that technology has given us to be able to do things that in ages past people just imagined that we'd be doing when we're wizards on the back of dragons and things in that nature. It's that people are born into this, and then there's just an expectation that that's how it always was, uh,
Mm.
because people just don't know how bad it could be. I mean, my family, escaped out of Europe to Australia, and, we're grateful every day to be able to do that. But some of those things that were the reality that they were dealing with, I've never experienced in my life, thank God. Um, but at least I'm close enough to it where it's like I've heard direct witness accounts of things that have gone on, and it helps give you an appreciation. And, that's as you said, I'm just on that cusp, it's like I remember the days before the internet where when I was a kid, you had to walk to a place to go and do things. And, nowadays that's like a lot of parents get very, very stressed. As you say, the potential for danger means that we insulate people so much that it compounds some of those issues we spoke about.
Yes, and the world was so much more tactile potentially. Now, this could just be an older, man saying, "I remember when the world was much more tactile." But to get music, we had to go to the record shop and save up your money and buy a single or an album. And now you just kind of hit download. Well, actually, you don't. You just buy a streaming service, and every song you could possibly want is available to you. And neither of them are particularly right or wrong. They're just different experiences. And it is interesting how, what is old is also popular as well. Um, so I think at the individual level, there's lots of nuances, but technology gets a rhythm and a cadence of its own, and it has done since forever. The world changed when the wheel was invented, of course, right? Imagine how rapidly horse-drawn carts started to appear when the wheel, and all of a sudden they could carry so much more stuff. And then the industrial age hit, and the steam engine, and what that created and generated, and then the internet, which was the most amazing thing, and now AI. So technology always has its own cadence and rhythm, and almost a life of its own. Where do you land on how do we manage this, or are you of the view that we don't? It will continue to evolve. I mean, I'm not even sure what the perfect question is around this, but with great innovation and advancement comes great responsibility. So, because everything can be everything can harm or heal. A scalpel held in the right hand is dangerous, in the right hand it's life saving. So, where do you land on this technology kind of management issue?
So I think that it's firstly incumbent on us to educate our kids as much as possible in the scientific domains.
Yeah.
Because if we want to have intelligent discussions about these things, people need to know what they're talking about. And sure, the top physics professor at MIT is going to be able to speak in a much more educated way than a high school graduate that did physics. But that high school graduate that did physics in year 12 will at least understand the language that's being used by that professor. And it's important if we want to be able to shape those debates and collectively decide what to do. I can't help myself. I'm an entrepreneur, which means I'm an optimist.
Mm,
And one thing that I really strongly believe in is that one of the most powerful tools that we have as a species is our collective intelligence. It's not, one genius or another genius. It's all of us all together that makes all these things possible. And so I really do believe that if there are enough human brains looking at these things, being able to discuss them properly in an educated way, rationally, we will actually deliver the outcomes that we're looking at. Um, and in some ways, I do believe you have to have that free for all to be able to, because that just gives you all the possibilities. But from the free for all, you want to extract order. And I think that's the part that where we can play a really important part.
how does that free for all leading to a sense of ordered collective awareness? And let's not even say collective thinking, because collective thinking suggests dumbing down some perspectives and ramping others up. It's this collective intelligent awareness. Let's call it that. And that is a free for all exchange of ideas very often. That's always actually served us well if you get the right people in the room. How is that mapping in this post truth world that you spoke about, where, a lot of the conversation isn't coming from fully informed positions, particularly online? There are a lot of mistruths being shaped as truth and a lot of truths being suppressed. Is there a shift in how we actually have to bring this collective intelligent awareness together?
So I just think that we need to get better at teaching kids how to figure out for themselves whether something is true or not.
Mm,
And we need to be unafraid to make those assessments ourselves. When I created Glide, one of the first lessons that I would teach kids was about the scientific method. And what I would actually use as an example to talk about was global warming. Or, we called global warming back then. It wasn't quite, you
yeah.
know, all the other stuff. So I posed the question in the class, right? And this is also an important part that's missing in education is giving people a reason to care. We can't just assume they're going to, because there are so many other things that they could be doing. But it's like, why should they care about, the scientific method or, cryptographic equations and, difficult things? You got to tell them why. So it's got to be about where you're going to get to. And when I talked about global warming, I asked the kids, I'm like, so is it happening? And lots of them had opinions and this, and I'm like, I'd let them all speak. And when they were done, I just asked another question. I'm like, okay, how do you know? Like you've said a lot of things, and it started making the kids sort of take that second
Yeah.
back. And then the last question was like, okay, look, we've got a lot of people with different ideas. How will we decide which idea is more correct than the others? And simply that process lets people be able to go and figure these things out for themselves. And just, really putting in a culture of being able to logic critically assess things that we may encounter because we can't stop the flow of information. I think that's a fool's errand. You're just gonna people maybe today forgot, but the internet used to basically almost entirely be, like the equivalent of what we call the dark web today.
Yeah.
And, out of those things, beautiful, people forget Bitcoin was used by an international criminal network called the Silk Road, where they traded all sorts of horrible things.
Yeah.
But if people that dodgy can use a system and trust each other with it, then how much easier it is for us, more trustworthy people, to use such a system.
Well, that is interesting. I mean, it's decentral. The whole blockchain technology is about decentralizing trust so that people can trust each other effectively just through a technology driven contractual arrangement, which does create speed. I taught in science subjects, based subjects, and instructionally explicit subjects or evidence explicit subjects fell out of favor for quite a while. And that's where critical thinking is actually taught. Opinion, to hold on to an opinion, you have to ignore evidence to the contrary. It's the only way you can hold on to an opinion, right? So, debate around the preponderance of evidence. How do you know? Is something that we should nurture. You've spoken about glide. You are, whilst acknowledging this 3,000 years of educational evolution that we've had, you also acknowledge that there are things in the current way we do education that are now maybe no longer systemically effective for the world we live in. And of course, education is full of great people who want nothing more than for children and teenagers to be equipped, right? I'd love to explore what you're trying to do with Glide, and what that will really tell us is where do you think the really innovative possibilities are to take education, to where we'd love it to see it for the 21st century.
So what I think we need to look at from the system perspective is putting in that decentralization, letting schools, letting teachers try something different, having still a portion, core learnings, and that's okay. But we've learned in economics that, when we introduce competition and movement of goods and trade, then we're actually able to optimize things like price. So similarly, if we're talking about educational outcomes, um, if we give people the ability and the freedom to move, and we both give schools and teachers the ability to innovate, with the warning that that means that people will go, potentially they'll have more people at their school than they had anticipated, but they might have less, and that there would be consequences, as you would in any sort of normal commercial environment. I think when we have more things like that, we will be able to better adapt to making sure that our kids are actually educated effectively. But then here's the other thing, you touched on it earlier. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm.
And there are some things about education as it was done in the time of Confucius or ancient Greece that is still applicable today as much it was applicable back then. And if you think about, if you imagine Confucius teaching, what do you imagine? A guy walking and a bunch of people walking with him, right?
Mm,
When you imagine the ancient Greek geniuses that so many of which we're familiar with today, and you imagine them teaching, what do you think about? Them outside in a toga, walking, talking, debating. Now, what was common in so many of those things was the integration of physical movement with learning itself. And yet today, where we take teenagers who I sometimes just call little balls of chaotic energy,
mm.
um, and we put them in this room and we tell them, sit still for 40 minutes and do nothing except concentrate on this stuff. Um, and we don't let them have that physical outlet for the energy that might be bubbling up. It could be nervous energy, it could be excited energy. They're kids, they're all hormonal at those ages. Um, we've got to really facilitate and allow for them to express that. And look, there is a lot of research that's shown you get improved memory retention and learning outcomes when you do combine mild forms of physical activity with learning. And even that was most of those studies were done with someone walking on a treadmill. So
Mm.
it's controlled. It doesn't have that beautiful chaos in the way that, let's say, when I was teaching glide, what I would implement is halfway through the lesson, we would stop and we would recognize and tell the story of a authority from the past that did a lot of really impactful things to advance the topic that we happened to be talking about on that day. So, there was a class about evolution. So the person I spoke about was Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
And the way that I would do it is I'd actually get everybody up. We would go outside the class. Now, for OH&S, we couldn't leave the grounds, but what we did do is walk around the yard for about 15 minutes while telling the story of that person, letting the kids ask questions, so it become quite dynamic. And, I still remember it so fondly that as I'm walking around the yard, kids are running up on the monkey bars and, like, doing a few things and coming back in and jumping on this activity and coming back in. And so for so many of those kids, some of which, I'd meet 5, 6 years later, they still tell me how much they enjoyed it and how much they remember about the information that I was trying to give over to them during those sessions.
Well, it's interesting. You started off the top of the episode talking about how so many educationalists are constrained inside a system, and the penalty payoff ratio isn't strong enough in the positive for them to step outside the system. And what you've just described actually is the typical student in a classroom constrained behind a desk, constrained inside a physical system. And yet we know that the Socratic method and questioning, while they walked and talked, if you've ever taken a class in a lab or a workshop, you get a very different dynamic and learning outcomes compared to when they're in the classroom. It became fashionable in business for executive teams to have walking meetings, and some of the best strategy came out of those things. And so why do we actually ignore this? And OH&S, interestingly, would be one of the reasons. It's safer, to keep people in a room than it would be to walk around. And so, the system is determining outcomes. And we have all this language, teacher-centered, learning. So chalk and talk, student-centered learning. And I've never actually heard anyone talk about activity-centered learning or knowledge-centered learning or whatever. You speak about, one of the things that I know you do is this idea of shoulders of giants, and actually, connecting the students to the notable names historically. I think it's a really interesting idea. I mean, you're doing two things. You're providing a bit of history, but in a science field, you're making it real because you're taking people back to source. And I think one of the things about being good at discernment is seeking source. In a post-truth world, we should always be asking, what is the source of that? So I'd love you to talk about this idea of shoulders of giants as a feature of Glide and part of your approach to education.
Absolutely. So This actually touches on one of these things that I got really frustrated with, but then, you know what, decided to try and build up a solution to it. I love basketball, I just personally absolutely love it. So when I was growing up, I'd follow people like Michael Jordan and Shaquille O'Neal and, people like that. And for better or worse, they were like my heroes, right? They did this thing that I loved better than anyone else in the whole world. Now, that's all well and good. But, how much value comes to society from the fact that so many young people look up to sports stars as their greatest heroes? And I'm not
Mm,
trying to dismiss them, but, what they do is, they kick a ball or they throw a ball or hit a ball, like whatever it is, it is an impressive skill, but it doesn't advance things societally. So if we wanted to advance things from that societal perspective, what we need to do is actually build up heroes who are learners, the heroes of learning. Now, doing it in the modern day is always going to have challenges, and each individual, no human is perfect, so you can easily discredit things of that nature. And I think a lot of historical revisionism took place where people are trying to break down some of those great people from the past, saying, "Oh, well, this person, might have made this one great discovery, but look, they also cheated on their wife, so we should hate them as a person." And I think that we need to be a little bit more morally mature than that to understand that no one's perfectly good and no one's perfectly evil. We're all somewhere in the middle. And, people can still, while perhaps having personal issues, achieve incredible things.
mm.
That is a powerful lesson for children. And I think that part of the reason a lot of them get so distressed in these days is they are allowing perfection to be the enemy of the excellent. Um, and so, what I really wanted to do is to use people from the past that it's much harder to bring them down about personal foibles, um, and let children aspire to be great, like some of these people that we spoke about from the past. And it allowed me to bring other things, to play. Which again, when you engage different areas of your brain and you get neurons firing and new connections being formed, it helps the entire learning process. So, for example, in one of my lessons, we talked about algebra.
Mm.
Um, and algebra was coined by a Muslim scholar called Al-Jabr, right? And as it was translated into Greek, it got kind of all mushed together. But I have a very close friend of mine that is Lebanese. And so I found the original words of Muhammad Al-Jabr. He's got a much longer name. I don't recall the whole thing, but I got my friend to say it in Arabic. And so in a class where I was teaching them math, it was like an opening of algebra for 10-year-olds.
Hmm.
And we did some Arabic in the class because, we're learning and we're being worldly and we're understanding that knowledge travels from place to place. It's not about one person, another person, men, women, it's not about that. Let's look at individuals and judge them for what they did, not for all of the other nonsense around it. And I think even though a lot of that was unsaid, they were all lessons that I was delivering to the kids just about the way that we went about doing that teaching. And that's why I think a lot of the kids, like I said, they remember that for years and years afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, you've had a long journey through education and academia yourself, a PhD in electrical engineering. So, anyone that's been all the way through the schooling system and into the tertiary system and then been in academia, you've spent a big chunk of your life actually constrained in this system that says, here's how you teach, curriculum, pedagogy, here's how you do this, right? And that that freedom to provide a holistic triggering of curiosity. To me, one of the greatest outcomes of education is the triggering of curiosity. If you trigger curiosity, people will go and find out a whole lot of stuff for themselves. But
That's
we shut it
why
down.
That's why I don't know if you know what GLIDE. GLIDE is actually an acronym that's
Yes.
for generating lifelong interest in deeper learning.
Yes.
Because absolutely, right? The first thing is just to make someone care about the result. And then the how and the why, like we can get to that.
Yeah. I think that's just a super insightful thing that someone cares about the results of the learning, um, and what that means for them and how they use it. And I think you just, I love this idea of on the shoulders of giants as a method of education, because you said before, people have to have purpose, and which actually means you need to meet somebody of purpose who's inspiring, someone who had this inspiration of purpose, right? It's Purpose is an overcooked concept today for people. They're hunting for it because they gut feel, think it's going to make a difference, but you need to see and witness inspiring people of purpose. And what is the definition of that? It's someone who cared deeply about the thing they're trying to do. It's not purpose if you don't care about it, right? If it's just language. So when we see companies, hey, the purpose of the company is, increase share price and be profitable. That's good for shareholders, but is it this deep level of care? So it's sort of interesting. I can feel a model coming on, and if you and I want to lean us into the healthcare sector as well, which is another interesting sector. But while you've been talking, a model has been forming in my mind, right? A general model that says so many of our systems, and correct me if I get parts of this wrong. I've been piecing it together while you've been speaking. So many of our systems have this central authority of some sort, whether that's education, healthcare, whatever. And this central authority sits in front of a complex requirement. I consciously didn't say complex problem, because sometimes these things are not problems, they're just a requirement. And that central authority will prescribe action. Do this. This is what we're going to do. And there's a couple of issues on this side of it. Validity of the chosen action. And then on the other side, human accuracy. It's an assumption that that central authority is incredibly accurate in their thinking. There's no human error. There are no agendas other than resolving this complex requirement, and that there's high validity, debated, understood validity from a science perspective on, what is the actual evidence-based truth of this? Now let's go and do this prescribed action. Now, that could be education with the teacher in the classroom. It could be healthcare with a doctor in the circle, or a specialist, or whatever. And you're not saying centralization is a bad thing. However, it's not the dominant system requirement today. How would you shift this for health? What would you change if this was the doctor? I guess there's a patient in here somewhere who's going to go out and be told this is what we're going to do. How would you shift this for health?
So one, I would do two things.
Yes.
One thing is I would connect an arrow from the prescribed action back to the authority, which is testing. Because we can prescribe an action, but if we don't know what happened out in reality because of that action, we're not going to be able to adjust and pivot as we need to. And I think, when we talk about innovation, we need to recognize that not having small cohorts trying different things is how we're going to be able to know what we should then apply to the
Yeah.
system as a whole. And then I think that specifically in healthcare, right now, you put the doctor in the middle. And I
Right.
totally understand why, because that's how our system works right now. But perhaps the patient should be in the middle, and the doctor should be the providing advice that needs to be measured against the advice of other healthcare practitioners. You know,
Interesting.
So, for example, if you're a person and you've got a problem with your back, and you go and you see a GP, and the
Yeah.
GP says, "All right, look, I think you might actually need back surgery." So the GP sends you to a surgeon, but and no discredit to surgeon, but surgeons want to cut because that's what they know as solutions to problems. Now, the surgeon, when you go see them, will usually give you, they'll tell you like, we can do this or we can do this, and these are the likely outcomes of those different choices.
Yeah.
But how are you as an individual going to make that assessment? Maybe I should also see a physiotherapist and ask
Mm.
them what that actually means, because it's not just about, directly what happens then and there. It's what's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years in my life. And perhaps I should see a chiropractor for an alternative method that may not require surgery, perhaps. And
Yeah.
maybe so, and like this is just an example, but really the idea should be the patient's in the middle, and we have a council of healthcare practitioners that are all participating and collectively making the best decision for the patient.
So this idea of a council, what we might call this collective intelligent awareness
Yep.
of what's going on, and that this is to address basically a medical issue or preventative medicine, in order to get the best health outcomes long term for a patient who's sitting in the middle. So we've shifted the patient to the middle, taken that centralized authority out of there, and we
Mhm.
shifted the authority to this council of people who bring a collective intelligent awareness to it, right?
Yep.
Then you talked about testing. Let's call that knowledge.
Or even measurement.
Yeah, okay, knowledge and measurement. So knowledge without measurement and testing, is a false economy. If we keep saying, here's the answer, this is the solution. And so we should do some testing around that, and I'll give that some color. And this is effectively, a feedback loop, based on outcomes.
Hmm.
So it's an evidence-based feedback loop. If the patient is in the middle, what's kind of occurring to me is this piece around here. Actually, maybe it's the piece. Maybe it's up here. I'm not sure.
You know what I'd put in as the green one?
Yep.
The patient's family or home circumstances.
Ah, right. So I'm actually going to put that up near council, right? And between council and knowledge, can I call it advocacy?
Yep.
Because what's going on for their family, and uh, you know, um, unfortunately, I, because of an injury, had to spend quite a bit of time on a spinal rehab ward, in 2020. And the saddest thing for me, now I've had like a 95% recovery. I'm mobile. For the most part, consequence free, um, from this spinal injury. But there was a patient on the ward who'd been there for a year and was not accurately relaying the testing, sharps and blunts, can you feel this? Because he knew he's in a wheelchair, he was going to be a permanent paraplegic, and he knew if he went home, there was no family support, but he could get it in the hospital. So where was the advocacy for that patient, as opposed to the system said, well, you got hospital or you go home. They're your choices, sort of thing. And sometimes a patient needs that advocacy just to make sense of what the council of practitioners, are saying. What I wondered about was technology and tools, because the fact is, even a council has human accuracy issues and human communication issues. I mean, one of the things that you say in Glide, we need to teach people much more broadly around human psychology, how people interact, and the money system and finance and business. So a lot of people work in this council, we can't assume they've come through the education system. So there are human accuracy issues still. Where do you see technology and tools and things sitting in this?
Well, I mean, I think that, as we'd spoken about, artificial intelligence can form a really important part of helping the council coordinate really effectively, helping the advocate to inform the patient more clearly what their choices are and what the potential impacts are going to be of it.
Mm,
And I do almost think that there does need to be perhaps one more section to this, which would be community and regulators and healthcare infrastructure. Because, like if you're living out out in
mm,
Wodonga, and you need to get, a highly complicated scan done, you might have to come to Melbourne to get done. So, that's got a lot of complications to it, and it involves sort of all those other parts to it. And I just think that the AI can really, if the AI was used by the healthcare practitioners, it'd be able to process a lot more information a lot faster. Things like what is the closest place for you to go get a blood test done, or things of
mm,
that nature.
mm. So I wonder, I wonder then if we can put a space in here, which is community. So, would you say community and infrastructure,
Yeah,
which is really a delivery issue? Um, once we've figured out what the pathway is, then once that first part of the model is figured out what the pathway is for the best health outcomes for an individual or the collective, public health, then what is the community capability and infrastructure capability then to deliver that? It might be true that we're living in a world now where AI is actually the link between all of these and that pathway. I mean, it's absolutely probably the greatest game-changing tool we've ever created for so many things.
for sure. And I mean, it enables things that we previously couldn't do. So, an artificial intelligence is by definition neutral. It doesn't have biases and emotions to influence how it thinks about things. So, if I don't want to share my health record with someone, for example, but I want to give them the ability to ask via my AI,
Mm.
questions about my health record that the AI can give them the answer to. So it doesn't expose my private data, but it allowed the practitioner to do what they need to do.
Yeah, interesting. So, this isn't just a model for the administrators and leaders of systems, actually. Parents could modify this to an education application, and parents can be the driving force. And certainly, the thing about the advocacy part of this is a non-technical quadrant. You don't have to be an education or medical expert to sit in the advocacy quadrant. So
That's right.
parents can sit in that quadrant alongside community for their children who are at the center, who are actually students at the center rather than patients. Somebody else can be an advocate for a patient and make sure that there's a council of collective intelligent awareness around them. Are we using the best tools and technology and AI? Are we leaning on the best knowledge and then measurement of these results? And so the advocacy can just start constantly going around the circle and checking on the other three quadrants to tick the box for the best outcome in the middle. Then it's about, okay, how do we access the various infrastructure and resources we need for the pathway? The access issue is always secondary to what are we going to do. So, it's a different way of thinking about things. So I'd love to kind of lean in on the technology piece because it's top of mind for everybody. You have expertise in and around the Internet of Things. I think today, perhaps the Internet of Things might even be an old term, and maybe we're talking about the technology of things today, TOT, and blockchain, cryptocurrency, a whole range of things that you have deep expertise in. You've published papers on this. You've patented products, been frustrated by the process of trying to take new products to market and things like that. I'd love to let you lean in on What does this mean for people in work? What does it mean for business owners? You're an entrepreneur. What does it mean for founders? Someone's going to go and launch something, they want to change the world. It's a big question, and I'm sorry to dump it on you as such a large question, but let's bring the tech story together for people.
So let's start off with maybe an easier part to answer it. Let's talk about for entrepreneurs.
Yes.
For entrepreneurs, it is a dream
Yeah.
because before, if I wanted to test out my app, I've got to go through a whole series of things to get the app built and work with software developers. And there's complications and decisions I've got to make, details on technology. And I'm just, I could be coming into it as a plumber with an idea for how to make a plumbing system. What do I know about if I should use, .NET or if I should use Python or, Flutter? Like, these are decisions that are out of the realms of depths of my experience and quite frankly, irrelevant to the proof of concept. And so with some of the tools that we have today, I think we see people around the world get excited of the idea of startup businesses. And again, it's like I said it to you before. There's never been a better time to be alive than
Mm.
right now. And so, as an entrepreneur, right, if you want to create wealth, right, you've it's never been as easy as it is today. There's numerous services where you can get on, and the AI, it's actually cool. It doesn't just write the code. The AI will often build you a whole AI tech team that will then go out and write the code because they're mimicking the way that humans would normally do it.
Mm.
And so you can get to that point and have a much better chance of testing your ideas. And so what I would say to people is the more open you are to learning, and the more creative you are with the imaginative expression of what you've learned, then you've got a chance to create the next billion-dollar idea. Because we don't know what it is, but there's going to be a lot of them. And there are things that are now possible that never were possible before. I don't know if you've ever experienced it when you sit around and you talk about startup ideas. Um, what normally happens is the first 50, 60, 70 ideas that everyone comes up with turns out somebody else already did it.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? Because, it means you're going through like a worthwhile thinking experience, but you only need one brilliant idea and you can build a whole business around it. So, um, again, people can look at it and they can feel a sense of despair. But in the same way that robotic automation didn't take humans out of the factories, they're still in there, right? Um, if you go up into Detroit, and you see all those factories building cars, there's plenty of people doing plenty of things. Um, Even in, one of the most automated environments we can imagine, like an Amazon fulfillment center.
Yeah.
Listen, we all know if they could build it with just robots, they absolutely would, but they don't. They always still include humans, and they don't include only humans with computer science degrees, just, like common all day people. Technology is giving us more possibilities, not less. So be inspired and come along for the ride is what I'd say to
Yeah,
people.
let's.
Well,
I mean, let's bring this back to. I mean, you're most proud of your family, and this idea of technology grounded family, kind of the family grounded technology question. You have sons that you want to equip for the world. They are going to live in an increasingly technological world, um, far more than you and I grew up in. As young boys. So, can we? Because I want to. You've just outlined you've got 15 plus different disciplines that you have expertise in. Um, and you've just outlined imagination is still the key differentiating feature. What you can imagine that others haven't can then be built with multidisciplinary technologies. But I want to bring this back to families and people. The suffering reduction. You talk about reducing suffering. You talk about no one left behind. I really like to bring this back to people through those lenses of the family grounded technology, reduction of suffering, no one left behind, and just let you open up on that because I know it's important to you.
no, 100%. And thank you. And I think that people today, when they walk around, um, simply using imagination, right? To look, and by the way, this is one of the superpowers of Homo sapiens. It's partly why we, survived as opposed to Neanderthals becoming the dominant hominid. Um, and it's our ability not just to imagine, but it's our ability for multiple people to imagine the same thing. And it's a superpower, even though it may not seem like it. It's very natural for us. Um, but more and more so, there are more possibilities now than there were before. If you think of someone as, incredible as, let's say, Leonardo da Vinci, and he imagined his flying machines.
Mm.
Now we have flying machines, and we can imagine different types of machines that he could never imagine because he could never conceive of the idea of a jet engine, for example.
Mm.
So there were great people in the past, and there are great people in the world today. And whenever someone thinks about it and they're like, oh, well, there were so few geniuses in history, yada, 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 just keep in mind how many people could read during that time,
Mm.
and then break down the people that could read as to the people that had the time and the energy to actually go down into those investigative fields. And you'll start to realize that the appearance of genius amongst humans happens a lot more than people would actually think off the top of their bat. And it's more so about realizing the potential that's inside each and every person than trying to find new people with potential that we need to find and identify. It's not like that. Just if people are the best people that they can be, every one of them is a genius, is the actual truth.
Yeah. What's an area? I mean, I'm interested in this idea of reducing unnecessary suffering. I have a real view that free enterprise is the most powerful force for good on the planet with the right people leading it. It can cross international borders. It can cross disciplines. It can do things that governments and charities can't. It's self-sustaining because it generates a profit. It has to look after itself. And so technology is such a key part of the business world. As you say, it's magical for entrepreneurs. Where are examples or an example where we could be using technology even more than we do right now to reduce unnecessary suffering, because there is suffering in the world that it doesn't have to happen, and we could be using technology more effectively. Do you have any kind of examples and walkthroughs on that?
Yeah, and I mean, and here's where I think sometimes people go wrong. If we start thinking about charity, well, where does charity start? At home.
Mm.
So, we live in this wonderful country with a wealth of resources, and yet in the last 10 years or so, we've had a worsening issue with homeless people. Um, and it's one of those really challenging issues to be able to deal with. It's one of those things that it's common in just about every society and every time and in every place this would come about. And it's resistant to many ideologically driven solutions because there's that human element that doesn't concede to it. And so I think at a very basic level, we should probably be measuring this in a much more specific and accurate way. And I'm yet to meet someone, when I go about walking up and down on the street that doesn't want to help these people.
Mm.
I'm yet to meet that person. Maybe they exist, right? But I haven't spoken to them. And if that's the case, then why is it that, the epidemic is worsening and not getting better? And I think that's because there's a disconnect between what the reality of what's happening and people's feeling of personal safety in dealing with that issue. Personal safety, not just from a physical sense, but from an emotional sense for how they look at themselves as a person if they were to try something that failed or backfired or things like it. And people are scared of it. And you should be concerned, but it shouldn't stop you helping.
Mm.
So, maybe if we created systems that tried to give to these people as much as possible with limitations to ensure that, you've got to try and obviously protect them from themselves in a lot of circumstances. There's and it's not easy. There are financial issues, there are medical issues, there are drug related issues, mental health issues that come into it, and there's no one solution that fits everybody, kind of like healthcare in general. You've got to just, like you say, almost have those advocates that go out there and truly engage with the people to understand them. Because in that engagement, if we can measure it, then we can build a solution that will be tailored for each and every person and have that best chance of being successful.
Well, you've just brought us back to the model on a homeless issue, right? Which is this kind of pretty simple idea of, an issue or complex circumstance at the top, put the person in the middle, the homeless person. What is that collection of or council of collective intelligent awareness that brings, a level of knowledge and insight to it? How do we use technology and tools to actually start to solve this while leaving them with their agency, their own personal agency? What knowledge do we have and how are we measuring that? And what are we measuring? Now we have a greater capacity with AI to measure many more nuanced aspects of this, which allows the people who are advocates for this right now to be able to access a more 360-degree solution. Then it fundamentally becomes an issue of what is society willing to pay at the community and infrastructure level. Do we really want to solve the problem? And are we happy to absorb the cost of that? Because it often comes down to what's society actually really willing to pay to correct this problem. So we come back to the same model again. It's been fascinating, Isaac. I'd love to wrap up with three quick questions, quick responses, just for people to know a bit more about you, if you're happy to do that with me, that little, play a little game for a few minutes.
Absolutely.
You're obviously you're a deep learner. You gather and study. If you could time travel to any period in history and to get to observe it, where would you love to go to and why?
How long do I have there?
Oh, you can have as long as you like. You get to observe whatever you want to observe.
Um, I would love to go to the time when they built the pyramids because I don't think we know how, and I'm fascinated as to what the actual answer is. And I think being able to bring that answer to life would actually help us solve other problems today. So,
Yeah.
and just one other little one is like being there at the Library of Alexandria right before it burnt down, so I can actually quickly take photos of everything in there and like just lost knowledge. It's always such a tragedy.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
being able to bring that back.
I would agree with that. I read a book, I think it was called The Power Plants of I can't remember the name of it, but the person was propositioning this idea that is it possible the pyramids were actually power plants? Using solar to generate some form of energy or power, as opposed to burial tombs. We don't really know what they were. It's fascinating. If you could spend a day, this idea of on the shoulders of giants, if you could spend a day in the mind of a historical figure, and when you do that, you get to understand how they think, who would you choose? Why
Einstein.
that person? Einstein?
Einstein.
And why?
Without a doubt. Because I have never encountered a person who was better at abstract thinking about pure physics than Einstein, who wasn't constrained by the accepted knowledge of the day.
Yeah, fantastic. And what would you say is the greatest realization? I know this is such a tough question, but the greatest realization that you've had in life because of a setback?
The- Okay. The greatest realization from a setback.
Hmm.
Um, I guess, it would have been previous times in life that I've trusted people who went on to show themselves not to be trustworthy. And I think the lesson for me was just because the person isn't trying to, like do bad to me, it doesn't mean that I'll be free from consequences if they do bad stuff to themselves.
Int- that's a really interesting realization. But you're not necessarily free of the consequences of someone doing things to themselves that, have an impact. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you so much for giving us this time today and sharing your learnings with people. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I love talking about education and healthcare. I love talking about technology, and we've covered all the bases. So thank you very much.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for inviting me on, and I look forward to our next chat.
Absolutely. Thank you.